British Prime Ministers in 100 Facts. Clive Pearson takes us on an entertaining and engaging whirlwind tour of 53 men and 3 women who have so far held the office of Prime Minister. We find out how they got to the top of the poll and assess their performance once in power. Delighted to be joining me live on the line from the UK, the author of British Prime Ministers in 100 Facts, Clive Pearson. Clive, good morning to you.
Hello there, top of the morning.
Top of the morning indeed. Well, it's certainly it's been an interesting sort of 18 months to write about the office of Prime Minister, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And of course, you said there's 53 Prime Ministers, men, and 2 women, I should say. But of course, we've had 2 extra ones since I finished the book with Boris, actually. So
you could actually have just had an add-on, couldn't you? Just a quick add-on, a little sort of staple to the back, because that, especially the case.
102 facts, yes.
Yeah, exactly, 102 facts, and one of them was it 43 or 44 days? Quite remarkable, as the saying goes.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what made you? I mean, the thing is, isn't it? The British political system is a system, like, for better or worse, like no other, and the characters that have made up the British political, have had the highest office in the land, have been an entertaining and eclectic, if not downright eccentric bunch, haven't they?
Yeah, and yes, actually, I think they're less eccentric in the 20th century, but certainly 18th century characters were amazing. And you go into the 19th century, you get people like Gladstone, who was prowling the streets at night looking for prostitutes to reform.
And we're saying was that reform in inverted commas, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Well, he felt it was his religious duty to try and save prostitutes. And surprisingly, he took them back home to his wife, and they had dinner together.
Right.
And, his wife saw it as her religious duty as well to help out on that. But what she didn't know was that he strayed somewhat sometimes with these ladies of the night. But that's another story.
It is indeed, and in a world of Instagram, social media, and Twitter, something tells me that any current incumbent couldn't get away with that particular speciality. But I mean, it is an interest. So where do we kick off with? Who is the first that makes the grade? Is it one of the Pitts? Is it Palmerston? Where what are we looking at?
You have to go back to Walpole, I think, 1721. He was the first Prime Minister and the longest serving. So, I mean, he just ran the country completely because the king at the time, George I, didn't speak English, only spoke German and some Latin. In fact, the king spoke Latin to Walpole. So he was the first and perhaps in some ways the greatest of the 18th century. But also, yes, Pitt the Younger, very long-serving, and Pitt the Elder, who was a great wartime leader of the time. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, when you're looking at those sort of more colourful at the beginning, because of, I suppose we put it down to lifestyle, wouldn't we? Because there were long nights. It was obviously a male-dominated society. It was a time of, I was going to say coffee house, but it was gentlemen's clubs, lots of port, lots of functions. And so a lot of them were beset by health problems. And not surprisingly, gout seems to feature an awful lot as well.
Yeah, that was the main feature of Pitt the Elder, who would occasionally turn up to Parliament swathed in liniment and all sorts of clothing suitable for his gout, and he would just sort of collapse from time to time. Famously, in his last speech, he absolutely collapsed completely, had to be carried out by his son as well, Pitt the Younger. So that was quite dramatic, really.
Victoria, of course, one of the longest-serving monarchs we've ever had, and we think about Victorian politicians, we're thinking Disraeli most famously. So what was, looking at the research for some of those as well, what did you uncover there?
Well, I mean, I've always liked Palmerston, actually. He was a remarkable Prime Minister. He believed that wherever British interests were threatened, they should send in the gunboats, basically. Famously in China, we were exporting opium to the Chinese, and the Chinese government wasn't too pleased about this. because obviously half of their workers were lying around drugged up. So they actually arrested British merchants who were importing opium illegally. And Palmerston was outraged by this because it was British interests that were being threatened. So he sent in the gunboats and bombarded Canton and forced the Chinese government to make a payment and to cede Hong Kong. So it was quite outrageous, really.
Isn't it the great thing about Palmerston? He spoke because he was a great orator as well. So he spoke like an angel, he fought like a lion, and he did a thing like a rabbit. That was the thing about Palmerston, basically.
Yeah, a great speaker. Yes, and he justified his actions in Parliament. Well, there was a later Don Pacifico affair where, again, he threatened the Greeks to make a payment for a British citizen. And people thought this was outrageous. But yeah, he made a great speech, 4 hours, justifying his actions, and repeated a Roman saying, Civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen, and used it to say, I am a British citizen. So wherever I am around the world, I can be defended by British gunboats, basically.
I'm just imagining, again, in a world of the tweet and the social media post, the thought of a 4 hour speech in Parliament would have a lot of them sort of quaking in their boots.
Well, I think that was normal in those days, actually. You go look at Disraeli, he used to do 4 or 5 hour speeches. I think Gladstone went on a bit as well. So it's something quite normal in those days, in the 19th century.
As we went into the 20th century, and obviously after the First World War, things would never be the same again in terms of, because we went into the First World War with 3 royal families, 3 royal houses, and at the end of it, the German, the Russian, and the British, and at the end only the British was actually still standing. So, and we have the reforms and the trade union movement, etc. And so we see a different kind of parliament and a different kind of politician, perhaps.
Well, obviously, after the Fourth Reform Act, millions more people went onto the electoral register and certainly saw the demise of the Liberal Party and the rise of Labour, importantly. But also, I mean, in the interwar period, it was a period of domination for the Conservative Party. Absolutely. And it did see some reform, but really it was quite a grim period, the interwar period. I think you have to look to after World War II, really, to see, reforms of the welfare state, that sort of thing.
How difficult is it to write something like this without being dominated by Churchill? Because, I mean, I know he's on the front cover of the... you recognise him immediately, but he just... I mean, he's... For better or worse, he seems to be the sort of colossus of... And recent politicians were trying to invoke his spirit as well. He seems to be this sort of... It's almost like the cigar-chomping elephant in the room, isn't it, sometimes? Because you just can't get away from him in 20th century Britain.
Yes, well, he was a colossus. It's quite true, really. Great wartime leader, and that's what he's mainly remembered for. But what I found interesting about Churchill was that pre-World War I, he was a reforming liberal and took part with Lloyd George in the creation or kick-started the welfare state. He started job centres and national insurance scheme. So it was Churchill who helped Lloyd George quite a lot on that. So that's something we just don't know about. We think of him as a, warmongering Tory, but actually he had a lot of things, a lot of hinterland. Actually, of course, he wrote lots of books and that sort of thing. So it's the length of his career, the breadth of it, I think, which is also interesting, makes him a colossus as well.
Is it quite difficult to write about, say, the recent past? And I'm thinking from Macmillan onwards, because 60 years ago, because you think Heath and Wilson, Heath and Wilson and Callaghan. I mean, forget Thatcher because that's a different thing. Because again, you talk about major figures of British political history, 20th century. Those are the two, aren't they? Those are the biggies, aren't they? You've got Thatcher and you've got Churchill. But for people like a Wilson or a Heath or a Macmillan, or a Callahan. Is it quite difficult to sort of sum them up, the 100 facts, because they're close history?
No, not really. What I've done in a lot of cases is to look back at their backgrounds, basically, which are often very interesting. So, as you say, Macmillan might not have done much in government, apart from telling people they've never had it so good. Yes, I mean, John Major, for example, I know leaping ahead a bit.
The Grey Man, yes.
Yeah, but he had a very poor background. He relates in his autobiography about how they just had one room and just one sink to wash in and do the washing up and everything. It was all very dreadful. It's because his father, who was quite elderly, had to sell up his business and they fell into hard times. But it does sound incredibly dire, the state they were in. So, so the background of various modern prime ministers is quite interesting, actually.
And does it also highlight perhaps some of the forgotten prime ministers, if you like? And I'm thinking maybe Edeners gets a raw deal or looked over, and even to a certain extent, others in of that area. I mean, just after the war, after Churchill, and those interwar years as well.
Well, perhaps it's rightly that Eden was vilified because obviously the Suez incident was one of the worst foreign policy decisions that we made, really. Although some people might say Blair going to Iraq was even worse. But the thought that he could ignore what America might do and go into Egypt like that was rather harebrained, really. And rightly, I think he was forced to step down. So, yeah, I mean, he was one of these people who was a great number two, probably. He was very good as foreign secretary, but not really suited to the top job. And Churchill himself said that. He said that, he after a couple of years, he will have to resign. Pretty much is what he said. I mean, and he proved right.
I mean, looking at that, because we think Chamberlain because of the piece of paper, the Munich Declaration and all that. But are there prime ministers who, and I'm thinking in recent times, who they wanted the top job, but once they got there, they weren't exactly, shall we say, they didn't fit into it like a hand into a well-crafted glove.
No, there's quite a few like that, actually. Who were able lieutenants, but once they got to the top job, were not really up to it. Eden would be one. Possibly going back to the beginning of the 20th century, someone like Balfour, who was very philosophical and excellent lieutenant for his uncle, who was prime minister before him, Lord Salisbury. Once he got the top job, though, everything seemed to go wrong. Perhaps not of his own making necessarily, but he didn't seem to have a grip on the business of government, man management, and all that sort of thing.
So do you see that they've had this driving ambition to get into power, or some had it thrust upon them, or some sort of fallen in by almost like accident?
Well, that would be Balfour, definitely, because his uncle gave him the job. He said, well, this is for you now, nephew. So, yeah, I don't know how ambitious he really was, Balfour, because he said he was very sort of philosophical, as I say, and said nothing really matters at all, basically. That was his philosophy.
So we got a nihilist.
He doesn't seem as having a driving force, necessarily.
A nihilist in at number 10. That would be quite something, wouldn't it, basically? I've got to ask you this question because this is always my favourite. I always get the Trivial Pursuit one, but Spencer Percival.
Yeah.
So does he get a mention? I mean,
yeah, but of course, yes. He gets two mentions because I give him because he was a very competent prime minister, but unfortunately was assassinated. The only prime minister in history to be assassinated. And I give a whole page to his assassin, actually. Because he was interesting, the background to why he wanted to assassinate Spencer Percival. We talk about an incident at the beginning of the 19th century, by the way.
Yeah.
He had gone to Russia and as a businessman, and had unfortunately been locked up because he got into debt. And that was a normal thing in those days. If you became a debtor, you were locked up. And he was languishing in a St. Petersburg prison for many, many years. And when he came out, he was really angry because he felt the British government and the ambassador there had done nothing at all for him. So he came back to England with a real grudge and felt that he wrote several letters to the Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, and they weren't really answered, the letters at all. So he just got into his head one day, took out a gun and just assassinated him in the lobby, shot him in the lobby of the House of Commons. So he's the only Prime Minister to be murdered, if you want.
Yeah. If it comes down to a top three of Prime Ministers, as in competent or charismatic, who would you say, who'd be a top three? Or failing that, which top three would you like a drink with in the bar with?
Well, I imagine Churchill, you can't miss out Churchill. No doubt you have quite a good few stories to tell, I imagine. But sort of, it is the war leaders who come out. So, Lloyd George, of course, World War I, the man who won the war, but also, of course, the man who, as I mentioned before, kick-started the welfare state. And I think, although maybe he wouldn't have many stories to tell, you can't forget Attlee, who actually, implemented, brought in the NHS, the welfare state, finished off the welfare state, cradle to grave, all that sort of thing. He might have been a very quiet man, but he transformed people's lives, obviously. So, those top three, I would say, the 20th century anyway.
And so how difficult is it to compile something like this and whittle it down to sort of bare facts? It's obviously, you've got to try and strike a relative balance, otherwise it would all be sort of loaded over those, loaded and lots of information about the ones that we can all quote from the top of our head. So to find the more not obscure, but perhaps the ones who have been a little bit sort of penciled over by the hands of time.
Well, it's true that some of the 18th century prime ministers didn't really do very much, and I might give them half a page. Some of them very poor specimens. The problem was I had 100 facts and 56 prime ministers, or whatever it is, I forget now. And it was a juggling act. How many facts to give each one, basically, was the problem. So like Churchill, I gave 4 facts, I think, and Thatcher would get 4. So the great prime ministers had more facts, and the less important ones were squeezed down to a half a fact or whatever. So that was the way it was a juggling act. It was quite true, actually. Yeah.
Well, it's a juggling act that you've managed to pull off. The book is called British Prime Ministers in 100 Facts. It's by Clive Pearson, who we'll be speaking to today. Clive, do you do internet? I mean, can people find you online? Is there a social media presence? How can people find you?
No, I haven't done that, actually, to be quite honest.
Well,
that might be an idea.
It might be an idea. I think you could do 100 facts online, one every day. That'll keep you busy for at least a part of the year. The book is called British Prime Ministers 100 Facts. It will be available as a virtual download from our own bookstore. Clive, are you thinking of doing, obviously, a little bit of an add-on at the moment, or are you thinking you're going to give it a couple of years before because we could have, the rate we're going at the moment, we could have at least another 30 Prime Ministers by this time next year.
I have to ask the publishers about that, whether they wanted to do a reissue of it.
The book is called British Prime Ministers in 100 Facts. It's by Clive Pearson, who we'll be speaking to today. Clive, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.